Hello and welcome to the Voice It podcast, where you get a backstage pass into the lives of some of the region's most successful business owners. Those people that have started with nothing and have turned it into a success. I'm your host, Annabelle Homer. Today you'll meet Andrew Manuel. He's the owner of the Plains Producer. And though he didn't start this family newspaper business himself, he has transformed it to encompass a large slab of the regional newspaper network across parts of South Australia. This is such a good news story, as so many regional papers across the country have closed down, but Andrew has driven growth. Not only does he operate the Plains Producer out of Balaclava, but since taking over the reins in 2008, he's now the Managing Director of Papers and Publications, which includes the Eyre Peninsula Advocate, the Two Wells Echo, and part owner of the Border Watch, and he's got no plans of slowing down. Are you exhausted?
Yeah, I am.
But are you loving it?
Yeah, but I get out of bed like before my alarm goes off, I'm awake. So I think when that happens in life, you're enjoying it. When the alarm wakes you up, you're being forced to get out of bed.
So many regional papers have hit the wall or haven't survived over the last few years. But for you, you have grown. And we're going to find out why this has happened in the first place. But before we do that, I want to take a step back and find out how your family got involved with the newspaper game in the first place. And it all started with your father. What happened?
We were living in Victor Harbour. In 1983, Dad was working for the Victor Harbour Times and the Milnes family. And actually, I nearly drowned in a pool party at the Milnes family house. Oh. So that's interesting. But they were running the Producer newspaper. It was called The Producer. It was 8 pages. I think they were struggling to run it remotely, especially back then, before fax machines even.
So they were running the Plains Producer from Victor Harbour?
Correct.
Gee, that would have been
difficult. So it would have been more an ownership structure, I would imagine, and it would have been, okay, you're a satellite team, just go for it. It was printed in Adelaide, I believe. So Dad had the opportunity to return to where he was born. My grandparents, his parents lived here, and I guess that was probably an opportunity perhaps to return to some security as well, to have his family around.
So your dad was in banks. You travelled around a fair bit when you were younger.
We did.
So where did you start and where did you go?
Well, Mum and Dad married, lived in Balaclava, then Port Wakefield. Their laundry was the morgue, actually. Fascinating.
Explain. What do you mean?
So I think it was like the temporary morgue. Say if there was the need. Yeah, I don't know. Mum's never really elaborated, or I've never really listened. So then they moved to Campbelltown in Adelaide, Keith, then Victor Harbour.
Your dad said to your mum, okay, we're heading back to Balaclava. Was she happy about that?
So have you been to Victor Harbour?
Yes, I have.
And you're sitting in Balaclava now. I guess if you were a broadacre farmer, you would be like, yeah, I want to go to Balaclava. So our house, we overlooked Granite Island. We could walk as kids to the beach. So I don't know if it was really our decision to move, the kids' decision, but it's back in the day where kids didn't really get a vote.
And did your mum get a vote though? No, obviously not.
That's a really good question. I think Mum went with the flow. I think she'd have no regrets.
So did your dad know anything about running a newspaper?
No. There probably wouldn't have been many back then that really had much idea, but he just went boots in and just went flat out. And I would imagine most of his awake hours were involved in running the paper. So he did the photography on the weekend, and then we would, as a boy, I would work in the darkroom with him. So I learned how to do black and white photography in the shed at home. That was one of the reasons we bought the house where we moved. Would you believe there was 2 houses in Balaclava that had darkrooms for sale? So 2 houses for sale that had darkrooms, and one had a pool, one didn't.
And you got the one with the pool?
Got the one with the pool.
Oh, thank goodness for that.
Yeah.
And just going back to your mum, she was the first, you said in a previous conversation that she was the first female bank teller.
That's right, yeah. So Mum's a pioneer in her own right. Actually, the Plains producer, or the producer back in its day, was run by a very successful woman as well. So Austin Henstridge's mum, whose name I forget, but Mrs. Henstridge ran this business for very many years, and then later Mum ended up running the business as well.
Okay, so both you, Mum and Dad, were involved in the paper.
They were, yeah. So Mum and Dad both worked here.
So who was working here when your dad bought the paper?
Oh, that's right. So there was a young journo who I thought was really old because I was 8. His name was Spog Sparrow. Was it Michael? I don't know. Anyone whose surname Sparrow is called Spog, I think. His life would have been frantic because of the demand of reporting and filling those pages. And there was a part-time lady who helped with the advertising as well. So then Mum and Dad moved into it. I guess they pretty much took on... So it went from 1.5 full-timers to then 2 with Mum and Dad running it.
So when was this? So we're talking the 80s?
1983.
So what state was the paper in when your parents took over?
I think it was 8 pages a week. It soon went to 16 pages. So I think Dad prided himself on making sure he attended lots of events, got lots of photographs in the paper, because I guess he wasn't a journalist, so perhaps journalism would have been a harder way for him to fill the pages, and he was probably had a bit of an eye for photography, so he used to attend lots of sport and whatever he could to build it up.
Over the years, you said that it grew from an 8-page newspaper to a 16-page newspaper, and when did it really start to gain momentum?
So the first child is Damien, who after school got into radio. So he got into media as well, but different. He's a sound engineer. And then my sister Leah had an opportunity to work probably about 1989. She did cadet journalism. So it would have been about 5 or 6 years after Mum and Dad sort of got it going. By then they would have had some other employees. Probably should have done a bit more research, but we've had many over the years that have been really supportive of the business and worked very hard. But I think at that point it was just probably gradual growth, really.
So did your sister start working for the paper?
She did. So she worked here for 3 or 4 years, did her cadetship before then leaving and working in other regional papers as well.
And is she still a journalist?
So Leah has just left her job at the government. So she was managing the education department's media team and had taken a break, and that's when we started the Advocate newspaper only maybe 2 or 3 months ago. So she offered her help and helped me get that off the ground.
Oh, so this is a family affair.
So we got to work again together.
Oh, that's
actually
fantastic.
The first time we've probably actually worked together.
You mentioned that you were in the dark room with your dad doing photography as a small child.
Yeah.
When did you realise, I actually don't mind doing this? I think my older brother and my sister have gone down this track. When did you start to gain an interest?
I probably didn't. I was more interested at school in music, and I wanted to probably do anything but work in the newspaper, to be fair.
Why is that?
I don't know. Probably I was a bit of a lost teenager though. I didn't really have that real direction. So
where did you go to school?
Balaclava High School. Yep. And I was really young. So I was 15 at the start of year 12. So I turned 16 sort of midway through and got my license at the end of year 12. So I hadn't really found that sort of direction until perhaps a year later. So I was sort of floundered around. I did a TAFE course in design and photography, which came natural because that was part of my life growing up anyway. Like, farm kids, how do you teach to be a farmer? It's impossible. You can't. It's kind of, you just got to grow into it. So I'd had that apprenticeship well before having started at the paper, I guess.
So when did you start at the paper?
So I had a gap year only because I didn't get into any uni, and
Because what, you didn't try hard enough, or because you didn't want to?
Well, I don't know. I really don't know. It was probably a different world back then too. It was probably harder to get into university, I think. And I really only wanted to get into one thing, and that was music, and then I wasn't accepted, so I moved on.
That would be hard to get into, I can imagine.
Yeah, it would have been.
And what in particular in music?
So in parallel to our newspaper world, Dad's always been quite musical, been in bands, and my eldest brother is very musical. My sister, anyway, and then I'm quite musical, and my youngest brother, who I haven't introduced yet, James, who works at the business, he's a drummer, so he's quite musical too. We used to have like jam sessions at home. You know, those memories were really good.
So you wanted to pursue that, didn't get into it, so then you decided to have a gap year and stay home and help Dad. Is that the idea?
No, Dad would not allow that to happen. If there was no work at the business, you're not floundering around here, you need to be doing something. So I guess he probably instilled that in me. I was enrolled into a TAFE course to learn graphic design. That was after I had done some paid work with my uncle, Robert Hoare, who is a plumber, and we were doing some roofing. So I did some physical labour work.
Get your hands dirty.
Yeah, I was probably pretty useless, I would have thought.
Okay, so after this graphic design course,
yeah,
did you get much from that?
I think I only did half of it because it was mid-year intake. I do remember that. So there was a photographer at the paper called Rod Penner, who now works at the Eyre Peninsula Country Times, and Rod left for that job. And so there was a vacancy in the family business, and Mum and Dad, as any business owner, tries to work out, so, oh my God, how we'll never be able to replace that person. They were so good. So you've just got to try. And then I think the light came on, okay, well, maybe we could ask Andrew to see if he wants to work. And hence, that was where I started.
What was it like working in the family business?
What was it like? It was very mechanical. Like, we were still using film, black and white film. We were developing that. So that was one thing I didn't need to be taught. I knew how to do that straight up. We were in this building, 9 House Street in Balaclava. It's got a cellar. The ceiling's about 6'3". I'm 6'4". So I had to stoop to do my job all day.
So your posture's not great.
Yeah, terrible posture, straighten my back up. But yeah, up and down stairs, and we had like an old machine that turned the photos into print-ready photos, bromide machine or whatever. So it was very mechanical. Everything was hard. So to take a photo, say there was a big incident, and we didn't really used to have any breaking news. It was more just a periodical, really. But it would take 4 hours to turn that photo around to get it ready for the press, pretty much.
4 hours?
You have to develop film. It was wet. It has to dry. And then you have to develop a print, which is wet, has to dry. And then you have a bromide, which is wet, has to dry. And then you can cut it up and then stick it on the page. And then you'd have to get all the text. And from a computer, well, at that point, we were just busting into computers.
This must have been early 90s?
It was 94, yeah, 94.
Yeah. Let's hop, skip and a jump to the position that you're in now. You're the publisher, or you own the paper.
Yep.
How did you get to this position from being a humble photographer to now doing what you're doing now?
So it wasn't long after I started at the business that Dad found out he had cancer. So I guess it would have been 6 months down the track that he found out, and then perhaps another. We died in October. So, yeah, so I really only worked 10 months with my dad, basically, before he died.
How old was he?
He was 48. Yeah. So I was 18. Terrible time for Mum to have to run a business and to grieve extremely. And then with children, very tough time.
You were 18 and your youngest brother was?
13, James was. Yeah. So Leah and Damien had both left home. So it was just the two boys and Mum and the business really to run.
How did she go?
She's a pretty amazing woman, strong woman. So she coped. I don't know how she did, but Mum had a lot of tragedy around that time as well in her life. Well, I guess the business, it was a really tough time. We had a journalist that worked here as well, Kay Ray, who was a real support for Mum, and she died suddenly, which was very tragic. She was very young as well, a mother of young children, probably teens, I would imagine. So that was awful for their family as well. And then Mum's mum died, my grandma, all within sort of a very close space, maybe 3 to 4 months.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. So
It's amazing she kept the business going.
it is amazing. Yeah, it is amazing. But you find a way, I guess. I don't know how you do.
That probably what kept her going too, knowing that
Yeah,
she had to keep
I think
going.
actually that's a really good point. So a good way to grieve is to keep busy, and newspapers are extremely busy. If you have a day off, you've got to catch up a day. There's just no other way around it.
So I presume you, at the age of 18, had to really step up.
I did, yeah. But while I did step up, there was a guy who stepped in. That was Terry Williams, ex-journo, been there, done that. So Terry had worked at the News in Adelaide, daily newspaper, and worked up from a copy boy all the way up through the ranks to editing, being in, interstate writing. So he was highly experienced. After he got out of being a journalist and an editor, he bought the Terminus Hotel in Balaclava, the pub, and he then went with his wife Lee and worked at the news agency in Adelaide, ran some news agents, and then I think he kind of got bored and wanted to help out. So it was like a week. Yeah, Dad was still alive at that point when Terry was introduced, but I think Terry had rung out of the blue saying, "Oh, if you ever wanted to have a couple of weeks off, I could do some relief work." And boy, was that helpful. So Terry ended up working here on and off for probably 10 or 15 years in different bits, I guess. So it would have been about 15 years, but he ended up doing some work elsewhere in between, but he's always been our support. He really helped us, and he was probably my newspaper mentor. What better person to learn from than someone who's worked in a daily? He really upped the ante. And so while Dad was good at building the business aspect, Terry built the journalism and probably taught me what true journalism is, I guess.
What was the main pieces of advice that you remember him teaching you in those early days? Do you remember those things that really stick with you?
Gosh, that is a probing question, which requires me to have a memory.
So did you move into the journalism field with Terry then at that point?
I've never been a journalist, sadly. I'd love to be, but I think there's probably 4 or 5 different professions within a newspaper, and can't be them all, and no one's the perfect all-rounder. I think my asset is working out what I can do and what I can't do, and then getting the talent to do what I can't do, and that's journalism, sadly. Yeah.
So what did you do when Terry was here?
So I probably did photography, I did design, pagination, but then I was supporting Mum through the business aspect of like employing people and the advertising aspect and designing adverts and sort of the back end of the newspaper, really.
So when did your mum decide to step away?
So Mum left about 2008, I think it was, about 14 years ago. I was about 30. Mary and I just had our first child, I think it was around about then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Mum was 60. She certainly had done her hard yards.
And was it that point that you took over the reins when she decided to step back, or had you already started to make some...
We worked really well together. Mum and I worked really well as a team. There was no real leader. We just both worked and we backed each other up, and we covered for each other. But by that point, Mum had been working elsewhere. She worked for Country Press SA a couple of days a week. And with Terry's leadership as the editor on and off during that time, and if it wasn't Terry, we had I'm trying to think who was the editor at that point. But we've always had great editors that have shouldered a lot of the load as well.
Is that difficult to try and source editors and even staff generally at regional newspapers?
Yeah. Finding skilled people already trained, we're probably almost better just getting people that are keen and not trained, and then trying to train them ourselves, just having the right attitude. But we've always fallen on our feet with employing. We've always had really good employees. We've hardly had problems with it, which has been great. You know, we've talked about Mum, Dad starting, and then mum and dad grew it to about 3 or 4 employees, but we're up to 21 employees now. So it's just continued to grow. But when I took the business on, I think we had 5 people. So I guess I've always just looked for people that had skills that I didn't have, and then trying to up the ante.
So you got 21 across the board. So let's talk about these other newspapers that you've acquired, say, over the last few years.
Part of the growth dates back to me doing an entrepreneurs course with Dave Hinger Sinclair. So I've heard of others talking about this as well, but he really ignited perhaps further education and perhaps skilling up. And I learned some really good tricks and tips, and got me really interested in, if I feel like if your business isn't growing, you're going backwards. And so there's only 2 ways to go. There's no flat line. So I think if you're flatlining, you're going backwards. That's sort of one of my business principles.
Did you think it was flatlining for a while?
Yeah, it was, because I guess the community's not growing and there's not much else to do. So we looked for spots where we weren't perhaps servicing, and we saw that as being in 2 Wells as a growing area. There was a little newsletter that was about A5 size, run by the Regional Action Team, and this is about 12 years ago. And so with their help and their partnership, we converted that into a newspaper.
So you've actually started newspapers from scratch. You just haven't bought newspapers. You've actually started them as well.
Yeah, started them from scratch. The 2 Wells Echo is still going. It is monthly. It's not a big publication, but it fills a gap because of that growing region. It really ties the community together. So it covers 2 Wells, Lewiston, Anglevale and Virginia. And when you go into that area, it's not like going to Clare or Balaclava or Jamestown, where you've got that real big centre and then everyone knows where they are. And I guess, there's a different community, I guess, but they're more like a sleeper suburb, and it doesn't have that central gravity. And a lot of people essentially are probably just travelling into the city. But what we find the newspaper does is creates that thing that glues everyone together.
Do you think there's scope for it to be a weekly paper at 2 Wells, or is it very much just a monthly publication?
Yeah, well, it's a free, so the business model is a bit different. So, yeah, it is thrown onto the lawns, and we wrap them here in plastic. But we've never really tried doing the weekly, but probably it's got too many barriers there, I think.
You mentioned that you've expanded over to the West Coast, and you've also got a stake in the Border Watch as well.
Yeah.
So the Border Watch, when did you get involved with that?
So the Border Watch closed in 2020. I think it was about August, and probably highlighted by the pandemic. It was becoming harder and harder to run a stack of different businesses, but particularly newspapers. We make our money through advertising. A lot of our customers were just not advertising. So in the first month after the COVID hit, we were down 40% month on month in revenue. So we were employing, I think we had about 14 or 15 people at that point. So in the business here, we had to stand some hours down. And so it was a really tough time for not only the business, but, our team as well, because of that uncertainty. So that probably replicated in the Border Watch. I think it got too hard for a bigger business. I think there was over 40 people working there, and that closed. And it was through Paul Thomas in Victoria, who was stuck in Victoria wanting to buy it. So he's an industry colleague, and they couldn't come over the border because of border closures. So he rang me up and asked if I would help establish a team. And yeah, so the rest is history.
So how do you go from things aren't great here, you've had to stand down people here because of COVID, and advertising was getting less and less, but then you had the foresight to invest in another newspaper. You'd think that because you had to scale down here, there wouldn't be scope to go anywhere else.
I guess the way of coping through harder times is getting a bigger footprint. So the one thing we haven't talked about yet is when the producer grew, for that to remain viable, it now had to service more people in a larger region. So it went from being like a hyper-local paper to becoming a regional paper. So I think that's been the secret of our success. So the plan for the Border Watch, they were printing 4 editions of the Border Watch a week, 2 SE Times a week, and 1 Penola Pennant. And the plan was just to print 1 big regional paper. So the first edition was 72 pages. Yeah, so rather than having small papers regular, trying to be all things to all people, we thought we would just be one, once a week, capture all that news. And the other thing, which was a pioneering thing, which was through sort of these colleagues, was to put a $3 cover price, which was quite radical, to be honest.
And how was that taken up by the community?
Community, fantastic. So they had lost their paper. And I guess they were spending multiples of $1.20 or whatever it was 4 times a week. So it was cheaper, I guess, in some ways.
I guess you've done that same thing here in the Plains Producer. You've encapsulated a bigger area. You're taking in a bigger footprint as well. Are you finding that you're being able to cover the region effectively?
Well,
and are you still covering those tiny little stories that you would have been covering with a smaller footprint?
Definitely not. No, of course we can't. We can't do everything, sadly. And if you're listening to this and you've got a story for us, please tell us, because we will write it. But we're not perfect. Yeah, we do our best. We work really hard, but there are a lot of stories that could still be told.
Has COVID actually helped you grow? Has advertisers really stepped up with the paper and advertising a lot more now that you've got these larger footprints?
So we did the growth, probably the real growth happened about 5 years ago. So it was prior to COVID, and no, COVID definitely made it harder.
Okay.
So the first month was 40% down, then it was like 30, then 25, and then 23, and we gradually clawed back. But that's when we started looking for other opportunities as well to keep our core business busier, and that's probably why we got involved with the Border Watch.
Yep.
And then probably since then, like you mentioned earlier, there has been a lot of papers close. So I've watched some of my colleagues, there's 3 involved. It's Paul Thomas, Bruce Ellen and Damien Morgan. So 2 are in, Bruce and Paul are in Melbourne and Damien is in Queensland. But they've actually started 7 newspapers in Queensland, and that sort of happened in the last 12 months, where News Limited sort of had daily papers in the regional centres and closed them. So they've opened up weekly newspapers. So I think I've been buoyed on by them and encouraged, and that's where the Eyre Peninsula Advocate was born out of that.
How did that transpire?
There was 2 papers on the Eyre Peninsula that closed. One was in Cleve, one was in Ceduna. And the Cleve Council wrote to some country publishers in essays asking if anyone was interested. We're looking to get a paper off the ground, what would be involved. So they sort of asked us to put a proposition in, which we did, and as was to basically ask for a commitment of advertising, but not only from that one council. There's 9 councils that were not being serviced in their eyes by a newspaper. So we asked for a commitment of an annual spend, which we had 3 or 4 councils agree to. So we said, okay, that would be enough to employ 2 or 3 people. But we've now employed 5 people working on that, just on the coalface, and then we really need another person in the office here in Balaclava.
Golly, so you're still searching for people.
We've got about 3 jobs going at the moment.
So if anyone's listening,
Yes.
if you want to work in newspapers,
Hurry up.
I know that your footprint is larger, but has circulation increased across all the papers, especially when you've got the competition from Facebook and Google and all the other social media outlets? Are you still finding people are still buying the paper?
They are still definitely buying the paper, but the way that people read the paper may be in different forms. So we have a digital edition, which is quite popular, but we print 3,500 producers. When I first got involved, it was 2,000. So we have definitely grown circulation, but we have grown the footprint. But if you went back into the heyday, the Northern Argus sold a lot of papers. So probably on 4,000 or 5,000 potentially, maybe. But when you think of it as audience rather than as just newspapers, so our audience is probably still the same because people are consuming news through our website, through our digital editions, through Facebook posts, and through the printed edition. So we're still reaching that audience, but the way that we reach them has changed somewhat.
And do you find that people still subscribe digitally, are happy to pay for a digital subscription?
So on Eyre Peninsula Advocate, it's a really good example. So our newspaper serves 15,000 people. So that's, from children to, that's the total population, to the elderly. And so I thought if we would get half of the households, we'd be doing really well, and we've exceeded that. So we printed 2,500 the first week, and we sold out virtually everywhere. So we're printing 3,000 now. So roughly 3 people read, in a household on average. You would say you multiply it by 3, so maybe penetration rate's about 9 to 10,000 of that 15,000. So it's pretty astounding considering it's only been going 8 weeks. And a lot of people are consuming that through our website, which is a digital edition. So there's like a replica of the newspaper on the website.
That's a subscription. That's
subscription.
Not
so
free.
it's paid for.
Yeah.
So that helps fund the beast.
Is there money in regional papers?
There is, but it's hard to find. And you might get a period of some good advertising, but then there will be periods where you're funding the paper to make sure it gets out. We're still going. We've always paid wages. Sometimes I think I'd like to be able to pay more for our team, but yeah, because it's not the highest paying job going around. So the light's always bright in the city and we're only an hour away, or whether it might be working for a politician, because there is a bit of a progression through newspapers as a training ground for, local government or politicians or the like.
I think you don't do journalism to get rich, do you?
No.
You know that from the very beginning.
Yeah.
You do it for the love of it.
Yeah. When you look around our office, we slap a bit of paint around and the carpet's a bit ripped, and so it's not the flashiest office in town.
What's been the biggest challenge for you?
The biggest challenge is the volume of work. It is just every day there is so much to do, and that is the same for all of our employees. There's not enough time in the day. And when someone has a holiday, the business is just relentless. There's no way of having a pause. So we close for 2 weeks over Christmas, and that's kind of a break, but you normally get sick or just so broken by Christmas time.
Run down.
Yeah, run down. But it is pretty relentless. So that's the biggest challenge, is trying to make it not so crazy and so hectic.
What are you the most proud of out of everything that you've done?
So the proudest thing I think I am, and the best project we've had, is the Valley magazine, sort of our flagship, our new flagship. So, and it's taken a while to get it off the ground. So it's been 3 or 4 years in the making. We saw an opportunity to do perhaps a bit more of a lifestyle tourism mag, perhaps glossy, and have been very envious of Darren Robinson in the Barossa, who's been doing it for 8 or 10 years and doing it so well. So what's the best form of flattery, they say? Just to copy. So we copied Darren.
But there was a hole. There was a hole that needed to be filled.
There was, but there wasn't 4 years ago when we tried to sell it. So we took it to the market maybe 3 years ago and had some sort of key meetings with certain pillars. And while certain people said, we would support it, we really needed to get a fair bit of advertising support prior to doing it. The next year we tried to launch. We were glad. Well, it must have been 3 years, because then COVID hit. But then what grew out of COVID was regional tourism, because no one could travel overseas. So there was perhaps an excess of funds. Business was doing better, Regional tourism was going off. Clare's is actually a great place to visit. So although we have called it the Valley magazine, it's for the Clare Valley tourism region. So that incorporates Borough, Wakefield, and so Boroughs in its own right is quite a good tourism region as well.
And you've incorporated the Flinders Ranges in the last one.
So the last one we added the Flinders to it, pretty much because I wanted to have a holiday. It's been my only holiday this year. So
when you wrote stories on your holiday?
Yeah, it was fun.
I guess a lot of credit also goes to your editor for the magazine as well.
Yeah, so that was probably a key element as well, because our team were just flat out with the paper. We had to probably, and when you're working week in, week out on the newspaper, you probably actually want to do something that's fun. So I think our teams really wanted to do this, but trying to fit it in is really hard. So it was easier to get another person in to manage that for us, like Gabrielle Jones. Sorry, Gabrielle. This is her, baby. This is what she's been wanting to work on for years, and we finally did it, and she does an amazing job. But Paul Dowling is the editor, and he coordinates the reporters and gets the news feel, and Renee makes it happen. She makes it sing with the advertising and gets that commercial aspect into it. Yeah, it's great. I sit down with Paul on the weekends. We test out some of the red wines that we might write about and do some layouts, and it's good fun.
I was curious, why don't you charge for the Valley magazine? Why is that free?
Really good question. So that was just the first two. See, the third one's going to be charged.
Is it?
No. But look, it's tough. You want to look after tourists.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we want to do the right thing. For the business model is built on free. It costs $16,000 to print that, so it's not that cheap, and then we've got staff, and we want to pay the team, obviously, so it's got a fairly high budget to break even, and it doesn't make a heap of money, but it's a passion project. Sure, we could charge for it, but then we feel that it might lose that edge. What it's trying to achieve is trying to entice tourists to go see all the good things and spend money in the good places and read about who we are. And
one person we haven't talked about, and that's your wife.
Yes.
And your family.
Yeah. So Meredy and I met at Berry Bay on the Eyre Peninsula on the beach. Love the beach. Meredy loves the beach, and I think that's where we just thought, well, this might be worth pursuing. 2 water babies, and we've been married 19 years now. So Meredy was teaching at Millerton High at that time, and she'd just finished university. She did 6 years of university. So she's the brains of the outfit. And Meredy now teaches at Balaclava High School, teaching chemistry.
And do you have any children?
3 children. So William is 15, Sophia is 14, and Joshua 11.
And are they interested in what you do?
No, not particularly.
So there's not going to be any budding photographers. You don't hang out in the dark room behind in the back shed.
Yeah, well, I guess it's they were in a multimedia world now. So I've seen some of the movies they make, and they're musical. And
they're musical. Okay.
They showed leadership management skills as well. I can see that sort of developing. But I don't want to have too much input. There's no real demands on them to work in the family business, but we'll just wait and see.
Where do you see yourself in 10 years' time?
Bahamas on the beach. But do you mean like in reality?
Yeah, in reality, where do you see the business in 10 years' time? Are we talking another newspaper, getting bigger, or just sticking with what you've
I did
got?
promise my wife that there'd be no more newspapers for a little while. But, yeah, it's funny when you grow, you create opportunities, and there are opportunities at the moment.
Have you got your eye on something?
I do, but I can't reveal it here. So
Really?
Yeah,
I can't get the scoop?
No, I can't get the scoop, not unless you hold the tape for 6 months.
You said it's a busy lifestyle, running a paper. What do you do with your spare time?
Oh, gosh. So I'm the chairman of the Balaclava Racing Club, and I've been on the committee for about 12 years, so that's great fun.
You're also the president of Country Press Australia. So is that the spokesperson with government? Is that what that entails?
Yeah, that's basically it. It's an advocate group that's made of 180 mastheads of independent publishers across Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia. Actually, we've got one member in WA now, and it's a 2-year term, so I've just started my And a lot of it is advocating for newspapers to governments and lobbying governments for the ear of government, I guess, and their support through perhaps advertising or whatever it might be.
Country newspapers generally across Australia, how are they travelling now following COVID with your president of the country newspapers?
All right, so in New South Wales and Victoria, they're really struggling. For the last 6 months, those lockdowns have been devastating. One member in New South Wales reported that they were 75% down this year on to pre-COVID revenue. And in Victoria, I think it was roughly 30 as an average. But yeah, look, we're talking savage numbers.
So there's going to be closures. Is that the inevitable situation? So
what's happened, federal government had a round of PING funding, so it's public interest news gathering, I think it stands for. And there was some money out of an ACCC inquiry, I guess the long winding path. But there was a round of money which really did help. And that was a 3-year fund. But what happened was that 3-year fund got gobbled up in the first year because they went and handed a whole stack of money allocated to regional papers, to other news sources. Yeah, so we missed out. And that's what we're currently lobbying for, is this second and third round, which was promised.
So Papers and Publications, that's your company name. How would you say it's travelling right now? You're in a pretty good position?
So having started this new newspaper, it brings us some economies of scale that we've never got to appreciate or enjoy before, but it's brought new challenges as well. So that's why we're in the hiring phase. So we obviously can see, growth on the horizon, and we're enjoying the growth and enjoying the hard work, but we need to team up and skill up. So there's more jobs going to, be filled pretty soon, hopefully, and then we can get our lives back a little bit more.
Andrew, thank you very much for joining me on the Voice It podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure hearing your story, and I look forward to seeing how the company grows over the next 10 years. So congratulations on what you've achieved so far.
Thank you very much.
Andrew Manuel, no doubt about it. The newspaper game is relentless, but so rewarding. Thank you, Andrew, for sharing your story. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate and bash out a little review. I love reading them, so keep them coming. My friend Nylan wrote to me the other day and said she has loved hearing all the stories from locals in the Clare Valley. And I received an email from someone in Scotland who's originally from Clare, who loves to keep in touch with her old stomping ground through this podcast. I love your feedback, and I love how it's gone international. If you'd like to find out more about what I do, head to my website, which is all written up in my show notes, voiceit.me. I'm a former ABC radio broadcaster turned podcaster, record audio memoirs for families, a public speaking coach, and I also run a drama hub for primary-aged children. Catch you next time for another episode of the Voice It podcast.